The investigation into the corruption in the Somali community in Minneapolis, Minnesota is intensifying, and it now appears that the crosshairs are on Governor Jazz Hands himself, Tim Walz. That's right. He and the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, at the very best appear to be negligent and have been completely corrupt in their incompetence, or they willfully ignored these crimes, if not encouraged them. Here's how Fox News delivered the report.
President Trump and Republicans are railing against Governor Tim Walz, and the House Oversight Committee, which has launched its own investigation into the fraud, is now requesting documents, records, and communications from both Walz and State Attorney General Keith Ellison after reports they and other state officials may have been warned and ignored those warnings, allowing this fraud to happen.
The state employees in Minnesota rang the bell. They blew the whistle that there was massive fraud, and yet Tim Walz and Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, apparently turned a blind eye to that for fear of political retaliation from the large voting bloc of Somalis.
Yeah, close to 80,000 Somalis live in Minnesota. They have become a powerful voting bloc for Democrats, but there are now multiple federal investigations into this fraud. Folks close to those cases tell us that what we've seen so far may be just the tip of the iceberg.
Hey,
Bill?
watching that.
That's right. And that's exactly what we told you yesterday. And it's what we told you when we first reported the story earlier in the week. And we showed you all of the details and the facts that those whistleblowers who were state employees of the state Health and Human Services Department, they were the ones who saw the fraud. They went through the proper channels. They told the Attorney General's office, they told the governor's office, and then they were the ones who were punished. They were the ones who were investigated and silenced and intimidated and told to shut their mouths because they were racist. We showed you all of that earlier in the week, but now there's more. As we've said, if you follow the money in this corruption scandal out of Minnesota, you'll see, yes, it appears some money went to a terrorist group in East Africa called Al-Shabaab, but other money went to a domestic terror group, the Democratic Party in Minnesota. And it appears as though one prominent member in Minnesota, the Attorney General Keith Ellison, who's a Democrat socialist, and he hates America, he may have even been receiving bribes from these criminals. Watch this.
Recently released audio recordings reveal conversations that happened between the Attorney General and individuals who were later implicated and in some cases convicted in the Feeding Our Future scandal. In those recordings, the Attorney General...
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
State your point of order.
Masons 124, paragraph 1, in debate, members must confine remarks to questions before the body and avoid personalities. The debate here is not any individual. It is the policy and the amendment.
All right, so you see what's happening here is here's a Republican in the state legislature. Yes, there are a handful of them in Minnesota who is raising the issue of individuals in the government who appear to have been benefiting from this corrupt scheme. And boom, Democrat jumps in there, runs interference, tries to protect, circle the wagons. This is the problem. This is how they got into this corrupt mess in Minnesota. Oh, we got to protect our own, protect the Somali community, protect Keith Ellison, protect Tim Walz, protect the scheme, protect the entire machine here in Minnesota. And watch how this unfolds now, because it gets obviously political and ugly. You watch this and you tell me who's trying to get to the truth and who's trying to cover up the truth.
Representative Niska.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Attorney General was asked in those recordings to use his authority to protect businesses under investigation for wrongdoing, and rather than distance himself or remain neutral to allow the legal process to unfold, he responded in those recordings, "Of course, I'm here to help."
Mr. Speaker, point of parliamentary inquiry.
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, there was a point of order, and I didn't hear a ruling or any resolution of the point of order. Was there a resolution to it?
I'll remind the body that there was no ruling made by the Speaker as to the point of order that was just stated. Representative Niska.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Attorney General in those recordings even urged the individuals, let's go fight these people. He was offered campaign contributions during that meeting, contributions that he later accepted. The release of those audio recordings raises questions about what's going on in the Attorney General's office that go directly to the need to pass the legislation that we had previously debated, House File 20. Although he has insisted that nothing came of the meeting, his office
Point of order, Mr.
blocks
Speaker.
disclosure of closed
State your
investigative
point of
data.
order.
Basins 124.
The A11 will help ensure that what happens behind closed doors in the Attorney General's office sees the light of day. We can protect people's privacy while shining a light on what the Attorney General's office is doing, who is influencing that office, whether it's those under criminal investigation, nonprofits, corporations, or billionaires with political agendas, because Minnesotans have a right to know when their Attorney General's office is working with them. Minnesotans have a right to know whether the Attorney General is telling the truth, that nothing came of that meeting. That's why the A11 is so important.
All right. So you saw, and then the clip we just showed you edited out the constant interruptions from the Democrats, constantly trying to keep the truth from being on the record and circle the wagons and protect their own. And when I say Democrats, I mean it. I'm talking about Democrats. I mean, just look. Democrat. And is there any doubt in your mind, if you were given this picture of this politician from Minnesota and said, okay, for $1 million, identify the political party this woman belongs to, is there any doubt in anyone's mind? Thank you. So Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, appears to be implicated in this audio that has been released that was recorded where he, well, you just heard what he apparently said to these groups that were under investigation. So yesterday, Keith Ellison showed up on Anderson Cooper's program on CNN because, you know, he's not going to get asked any tough questions. He's going to get a full body massage from Anderson Cooper. It was pretty much that. But he was asked one simple question, given everything that we know now, given the billions of dollars of fraud that has been uncovered, Attorney General Ellison, what would you do differently now in retrospect? His answer? Amazing.
I do want to ask you about the fraud scandal. I mean, because the president's comments seem at least in part fueled by, or he's talking about this fraud scandal that we mentioned earlier involving that charity called Feeding Our Future. The vast majority of these 70 defendants charged in the case were Somali. For perspective, those are nearly 80,000 Somalis in the state. How much, I mean, critics have said the state officials, including you and the governor, did not act fast enough or quickly enough to investigate charges of fraud against the Feeding Our Future and did little to flag their allegations to federal authorities. I know you said it was the federal government that didn't move fast enough. Is there something you wish you had done differently?
No, we, first of all, the Department of Education denied claims when questionable claims were made about these meals. My office went to court, explained that to the court. A judge actually found the department in contempt for denying claims. And we cooperated fully and worked well with the FBI. We're glad that we took the action that we did.
Yeah, we did. We did great here. Hell of a job there, guys. Wouldn't do anything different. Are you kidding? We get a gold medal for our work. Where billions of dollars of fraud happen right under our nose. And it just so happens that the groups and individuals that are implicated in all of that fraud are pals and donors to our political party. That right there is the arrogance of one-party rule. That right there is the arrogance of a man who thinks that he can do pretty much whatever he wants and there will be no political repercussions because he's a Democrat and he's in Minnesota. We'll see about that. We'll see. That said, the highest profile Democrat in Minnesota is not Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, former congressman, and not even the governor, Tim Walz, the former running mate of Kamala Harris for the national ticket. No, the highest profile politician, Democrat, socialist from Minnesota is Ilhan Omar. And Ilhan Omar sat with Jake Tapper. Now, I want you to watch this interview because you would think that the thrust, the main focus of this interview would be the corruption in the Somali community that Ilhan Omar represents. No. The thrust and focus is how racist Donald Trump is for having ICE come into the community and deport everyone living there who is in the country illegally and who is continuing to commit fraud and break the law. Jake Tapper, America's finest journalist, ladies and gentlemen.
Internationally, new video shows Border Patrol Commander Gregory Bovino on the ground in the suburbs of New Orleans today. This is the first day of the immigration crackdown in that city, with the Department of Homeland Security aiming to make more than 5,000 arrests. That crackdown coming as a separate immigration operation is underway in Minnesota, that one targeting Somali immigrants who have been the subject of public scrutiny after a New York Times report detailing how fraud took root in pockets of the community, with some, quote, making small fortunes by defrauding government programs of more than $1 billion of taxpayer money during the pandemic. We're talking about dozens of people in a community of thousands, of course. Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota is here with.
Did you hear that setup? This is the greatest criminal government fraud crime in our country's history. And Jake Tapper, you know, the bloodhound who was leading the charge on the Russian collusion hoax, which was never a real story. Jake Tapper, America's last remaining journalist who really learned his lesson for being duped by Joe Biden, who promised everybody that he was of sound mind and perfect health. And then, oh gosh, Jake Tapper decided after the debate that maybe that wasn't true. So then he got rich writing a book about it. Jake Tapper says pockets of the Somali community, just a few dozen people in a community of thousands. So it's really not that big a deal, really. Okay, good setup there, Jake. Now let's watch the love fest. Yeah, Jake, by the way, real fast, she's not going to date you, man. Okay, you're not her type. You're not even a cousin, let alone a brother. So it ain't going to happen.
With me now. First of all, federal prosecutors say 59 people have been investigated in these schemes so far. Americans at large stole tens of billions of forms of aid during the pandemic all over the country. Minnesota's fraud scandal stands out, according to federal auditors. What are you hearing from investigators right now?
Well, I've been following the cases closely as they've gone through the courts, and we know that there are more indictments possibly coming. I think that number might go up to 73 is what I'm hearing.
Okay. Can you shed any light on why the fraud got so out of control in Minnesota?
I think what happened is that, you know, when you have these kind of new programs that are designed to help people, you're oftentimes relying on third parties to be able to facilitate. And I just think that a lot of the COVID programs that were set up, they were set up so quickly that a lot of the guardrails did not get created.
Did you get that? Why is the fraud so rampant in your community in Minnesota? Well, it's the government's fault. They didn't put up the proper guardrails to protect against fraud. Well, hold on a minute. And this is where Jake Tapper, if he really were a journalist, would say, excuse me, isn't it the criminal's fault? Isn't it the criminal's fault? So if a bank gets robbed, you got to blame the bank for not having good enough security to keep the bank robbers from robbing the bank. The real people who are responsible for this, the reason it happened, is because the bank didn't have good enough security. And oh, by the way, Minnesota is a pretty big state with a pretty big population, but this fraud is in this community, in this little area of Minneapolis, overwhelmingly populated by Somali. It's not like the people up in northern Minnesota, right near the Canadian border, out doing their ice fishing. They were involved in this fraud. It's not like the southern Minnesota people who actually like good football, so they go down and watch the Packers or maybe cross the lake and watch the Lions. People down there, they weren't involved in this either. If it's true that the real fault lies with the programs and the way they were set up without the proper guardrails, wouldn't all the Minnesotans be dipping in and stealing the money? But it was just the Somali community that did it. What a remarkable answer, and even a more remarkable lack of follow-up from one Jake, the last remaining great journalist in Washington, Tapper. Unbelievable. Oh, by the way, one more little item there. You know, when we set up these programs for COVID, it was done so quickly that we didn't have the right guardrails. Who's we exactly? Who's they? Who was responsible for the guardrails? That would be Tim Walz. That would be her governor, Democrat Tim Walz, who was just the running mate on the national ticket. So to save her own Somali community's corrupt ass, she just threw Tim Walz under the bus. And Jake Tapper, by the way, wasn't smart enough to pick up on that either. Okay, let's get back to it.
Obviously, whatever the ethnic group, the actions of a few dozen should not impugn an entire community of thousands of people. Okay, I want to make that very clear. President Trump has used this fraud to make rather, to me, shockingly bigoted comments about Somalis in general, including you, but the entire Somali community in Minnesota. He did it yesterday and he did it again today. Let's run some of that.
Okay, so and when we'll watch this, I promise. But you saw what happened there. Opening question, first question. Why is it a handful of people, couple dozen, pockets of the community? Why exactly do you think this happened? She blames the lack of guardrails. And then he immediately says, well, yeah, and the most important thing is because a handful of people do something corrupt like this, the whole community couldn't be blamed. Okay, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Now let's talk about what a bigot Donald Trump is. And now the rest of the interview is that. Did I mention Jake Tapper is the only last remaining true great journalist in Washington, D.C.? By the way, you know how I know that? Just ask him.
These Somalians have taken billions of dollars out of our country. They've taken billions and billions of dollars. They have a representative, Ilhan Omar, who they say married her brother. She should be thrown the hell out of our country. And most of those people, they have destroyed Minnesota. She should not be, and her friends shouldn't be allowed. Frankly, they shouldn't even be allowed to be congresspeople, okay? They shouldn't even be allowed to be congresspeople because they don't represent the interests of our country.
It's pretty shocking to hear it, although I don't know how shocked you are at this point anymore. But Somali immigrants, in general, you in particular, have been the target of his attacks for a long time. What's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not shocked because we know that the president oftentimes resorts to very bigoted, xenophobic, Islamophobic, racist rhetoric when he is trying to scapegoat and deflect from the actual failures that he has himself. We know that this administration has not fulfilled majority of the promises that they've made, whether it is bringing costs down, whether it is the tariffs that are decimating businesses in the United States, whether it is the possible war crimes that his defense secretary is committing. And so to me, it is important for us, one, to remind folks that we are Americans. We're not going anywhere, and we will continue to be in this country. And two, that Minnesotans are resilient, and we will continue to thrive.
What is the practical impact when a president of the United States demonizes an entire group of people based on ethnicity? And again, you can point to any ethnic group and find dozens of people in that ethnic group who are committing a particular crime. The mafia comes to mind, right? But no one, you don't hear people saying that about Italians. They did 100 years ago, but they don't do it today. What is the practical effect on the Somali community when the president says things like that?
I mean, it creates fear. And there is a possible danger that a lot of the people who follow the president have exhibited violence in many cases, especially in my case, whenever he has said something about me that is derogatory or says I'm a threat to the country. I've gotten death threats. There's so many people that have been incarcerated over the years that have been encouraged by the president's words. And so there is fear for Somalis, not just in Minnesota, but across the country, that some of these people might attack and harm them.
Ahead of the immigration crackdown in Minnesota, CNN asked the Department of Homeland Security spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin about the remarks from the president. Here's what she had to say.
And this is not about politics. This is about public safety. We saw what just happened last week with the terrorist attack against us here in our nation's capital, where one of our great heroes, Sarah Beckstrom, was killed. That's what the precipice of this was.
What's your response to that?
Well, it's certainly not. We know that Somalis, over 90% of them, are citizens of this country. Majority of them having born in the United States, and we know that if you are a criminal, you already have deportation orders, and there is an easy way for them to do that instead of creating this sort of fear where they are having raids. And today we saw them stopping citizens, and people were proving their citizenship by showing their passports. And so we know it has really nothing to do about keeping a community safe. It's actually terrorizing a community and creating fear.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate that too. That was a hell of a job there, Jake. So one question about the fraud that was framed with complete, deflection and excuses, and it's like it's a handful of people. It's just small pockets. It is literally the largest case of government fraud in our history. And we're just hitting the beginning parts of this story, a story that Jake and his pals at CNN ignored until the New York Times just wrote about it a couple of weeks ago and gave them permission to do it. Hey, Jake, you covered the presidential election. I know it because you wrote a book and made millions on it. In fact, you interviewed Tim Walz, I know, during the campaign. Did you ever ask him one question about this? Because it ain't a new story. It was going on last year during the campaign. And now the entire framing of that interview was one question about the fraud, and the rest of it, the last 5 minutes, all about allowing Ilhan Omar to call Donald Trump a racist and a bigot, and to bend over backwards to say that any criticism of the Somali community at large is like 100 years ago, where all Italians were blamed for the mafia. But see, here's the interesting thing. Italian Americans, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, today, they call themselves Italian Americans. They when we have a Columbus Day parade down Fifth Avenue in New York, it's about Christopher Columbus being an Italian who came to America, and it's about America and about their pride in this country, right? And they never would, for an instant, think that they would stand up there, whether it was 100 years ago or today, and say, I'm an Italian first. And if there was an Italian American politician, a mayor, a congressman, a senator, right? We've had them. What would the fallout be if that Italian American or American of Italian descent politician stood up and say, I don't represent my community. I don't represent my state. I don't represent America. Theirs are not my interests. My interests are Italy's interests. That's what I'm here for. Would that politician, that American politician, would it be legitimate to criticize that person? Would it be legitimate to say, I know you're here in the country legally, and I know that you've got your citizenship, but when you stand up and literally, or when your supporters celebrate you because your main priority is to look for the interests of a foreign country over your own nation, I think that's worthy of criticism, don't you? And I don't think it's bigoted to say so. I ask that hypothetical question because, well, maybe you've seen this video. Clearly, Jake Tapper hasn't, because I think it would have been an appropriate question to ask her about.
xildhibaan ilhaan cumar oo magaca Soomaaliya qalin dahab ah ku qortay qadiyadda ilhaan ma aha qadiyad ilhaan ma aha qadiyad Minnesota ma aha qadiyad reer Maraykan qadiyadda ilhaan waa qadiyad Soomaaliyeed.
See, if I had Jake Tapper's budget and his set and his teleprompter, And I had Ilhan Omar sitting across from me while she was talking about how bigoted and despicable and xenophobic Donald Trump was, and anyone else's who questions her job as a representative in Minnesota and it challenges whether her loyalties are in some way divided. I would have played that clip and said, how do you explain this? You were standing right there, smiling and nodding along. Is it true? That would have been a simple question. Or as she spent all of her time deflecting any kind of criticism over the Somali community and the corruption there, just a handful of people, maybe 70 at most, but that doesn't really speak for the whole community. Jake Tapper could have done this. Jake Tapper could have said, yeah, okay, that's fair enough. However, considering the fact that it's only 70 or 80 people in the Somali community, isn't it amazing that you, Congresswoman Omar, actually promoted a restaurant and a program run by one of those 79 individuals who is accused of defrauding Minnesota? I mean, if it's only a small handful of people, what are the odds that you would be on tape supporting one of those 79 people and promoting their fraudulent program? Oh, you don't know what I'm talking about? Here, this is the video right here.
horta aad iyo aad aan ugu faraxsanahay in maanta safaari aan soo gaarnay sida dadka badan ay u og yihiin ciyaalkeena yaryar ilaa iyo number la eg 20 milyan oo ciyaal iskooley ah waxay cuntadooda ka helaan iskoolka kaliya marka waxaan fursad u helnay in aan sharci soo gudbino oo la dhahayo Meals Act oo u fududeynayo in waqtigaanay pandemic aan ku jirno oo dhalinyarada iskoolka aynan joogin oo guryahooda ay joogaan aynan gaajoonin oo familkoodi wili ay fursad u helaan in cunto ay helaan oo meelo qaarkood laga qaybinayo ay cuntada ka soo qaadan karaan marka aadaan ugu mahadcelinayaa safari in ay tahay meelaha sayti oo diyaarinayo cunto maalin kasto dhalinyarada ciyaalkii iyo familkoodina.
Yeah, so the Safari restaurant that she's there standing there during the pandemic helping to pass out food and promoting this program, giving meals to children who would starve during the pandemic if it weren't for this government program and funded by the taxpayers of Minnesota and taxpayers of the federal government. That Safari restaurant and that program is part of the corruption scandal. The owner, who donated to her campaign, by the way, what a coincidence, was convicted in a $250 million fraud scheme using that very Feeding Our Future program to defraud the people of Minnesota and the American taxpayer. And there was Ilhan Omar on video celebrating that restaurant and celebrating the program. And Jake Tapper didn't think to bring that up. He may have thought about it, but then he thought again, because see, then you don't get Ilhan Omar to come into studio and sit with you. And let's face it, if you're really trying to inform and energize the audience at CNN, you don't want to talk about this story and the fraud and waste and government abuse and all that stuff. That's boring. No, you want to bring on Ilhan Omar and say, all right, let's talk about what a bigot Donald Trump is. Because really, that's what the programming's been on CNN and certainly on Jake Tapper's show for a decade now. And oh, and they're in the toilet in the ratings, aren't they? And they've lost their audience and they've lost their credibility. I'm sure those two things aren't related. Hell of a job, Jake. And Congresswoman Omar, you keep up the great work. You're doing a hell of a job too. You are the finest representative for the nation of Somalia that I can imagine. Hell of a job.